Welcome to this, the third in the Dean's Lecture Series for 2013. I'm very pleased to see you this evening, and very pleased you joined us on such a blustery and wet, suddenly wet afternoon with a cold front moving through. But I'm sure that the evening will be well spent, and you'll be very pleased that you took the effort to be here. We're extremely pleased this evening that we are joined by the Deputy Mayor for Economic Development and the Director of Commerce for the City of Philadelphia, Alan Greenberger, who will present his lecture here, Cities, Growth and Design Perfect Together. It's a theme, I think, that resonates with our city of Melbourne and in which we see great value. My name is Tom Cavan. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building Planning here at the University of Melbourne. And I'll begin the proceedings this evening, as I traditionally do, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, the people of the Wurundjeri, and pay respect to their elders and their families past and present. Through the Dean's Lecture Series, we seek to present vital perspectives from across the globe on issues which are important here in the state of Victoria and the city of Melbourne. Alan Greenberger's expertise sits across architecture, property, urban planning, and policy. Alan spent 34 years in private practice as an architect. Indeed, he worked on the Canberra Parliament House project soon after the competition and was part of the team that won that contract. He was with Giurgola Associates, or MGA and Partners, in Philadelphia. He left the project in Canberra and went back to Philadelphia to run MGA when Aldo Giurgola stayed in Canberra. So Alan then joined the city of Philadelphia in 2008 after his practice as an architect, where as Deputy Mayor he oversees the integration of long-range strategic planning with implementation of business and real estate development goals. He's played a leading role in the redevelopment of the Philadelphia zoning code and has initiated a 5-year-long comprehensive plan for the city, Philadelphia 2035. Design plays a central role in how we feel and perceive and look at our place here in this city, as indeed in all cities. In his lecture this evening, Alan will explain how the phrase he uses, the DNA of a city, influences how that city works and develops. By understanding this DNA, we can direct our efforts to utilizing the city's assets and then addressing its weaknesses and realizing its opportunities. So Alan will discuss the inherent interplay between place, ambition, and character, and the ways in which successful cities balance these sometimes competing objectives. And across the globe, we see exactly the same drivers in city growth. There's government, there's institution, there's business. So this evening, we'll consider the role of these drivers and explore how they can effectively produce a better quality of life. In Melbourne, we see growth in the inner city and its expanding urbanization of our surrounding commuter towns. This brings with it the issues of livability, environment, access, and transport. As Alan will explain, there's much that resonates with Pennsylvania, with Philadelphia, and the issues that they've successfully addressed. So, in summary, Alan will speak of the consequences of urban form, of climate, and of quality of life. With his background of long and deep architectural practice on substantial projects, his background in urban governance, Alan's remarkably placed to take us through this discussion this evening, and we're very privileged that he's taken his time out from a very busy schedule as a major urban official and joined us here today in Melbourne. So welcome back to Australia, Alan, and very nice to see you here. Please welcome Alan Greenberger.
Well, good evening, everybody. Oh, wait, I have to turn on the one that's on my hip, too. Okay. So everybody can hear, right? Good. Thank you, Tom. That was a lovely introduction. And before I get started, I also want to acknowledge my sort of friend hosts here in Melbourne, Jen and John McNabb, who we got to know each other and became very close friends in when we worked at MGT. And I also want to acknowledge that my daughter Julia and my son-in-law Josh are here on this trip with me. Julia was 2 months old when we moved to Australia, and I thought this might be a nice opportunity to plant in some images that she obviously didn't have from being 2 months old when we first came. It's great to be back here. I love this country. I love this city. I hadn't been back to this city in 28 years, so there's an awful lot that I feel I've missed out on, and I know Tom now has set me up to say something incredibly profound, and so the pressure is definitely on. You have this very nice intro slide for me, but I have an intro slide for you that maybe looks a little more familiar. Although I apologize, I pulled it off of the web like most of these images, so it may be a little fuzzy. Maybe that's good. The best place to start is probably to give you a sense of my own personal stories, because for an American architect, I do have an unusual story. And sometimes I refer to myself as the accidental deputy mayor. And so what you need to know is that the term deputy mayor actually has no legal standing in what's called the Home Rule Charter of Philadelphia, which is a document from 1952 in an era of massive reform worldwide, including in the city of Philadelphia, that sort of rethought government. This is what happened after World War II throughout the United States. The Home Rule Charter gave the city of Philadelphia certain privileges, carved up the city into councilmanic districts, and that fellow there, Richardson Dilworth, was the first mayor of this reform era after probably 50 or 60 years of single-party rule in Philadelphia that had gone fairly corrupt. So this position, deputy mayor, is one that several mayors have chosen to use on their own, but its meaning is varied. For many mayors, deputy mayor meant like a friend who was in charge of special projects. And so whenever, some of us hear deputy mayor and we get very nervous that that's what they mean. That's not what it means here. Our mayor borrowed this from the mayors of Washington and New York, and basically he has created 6 cabinet-level positions, each of whom has a direct leadership over a portfolio of like mission public and quasi-public agencies. So here's my crew, 12 agencies. There are so-called line agencies of the government, licenses, planning, commerce, which I'm also the director of, housing and community development, and historical commission. And then there's a bunch of independent NGOs that have their own independent boards, and they consist of our quasi-public economic development corporation, our redevelopment authority, our system of workforce development, and our public housing agency. So that's a big entity. I have these 2 lovely young people there on the left, a chief of staff and a deputy chief of staff, who are, the real spectacular 29, 30-year-old people who run all governments everywhere, and they run mine. I joined the government 5 years ago, as Tom mentioned, having spent 34 years at Mitchell Giurgola. There we are, Mitchell Giurgola, Firm of the Year, 1976. The arrow is pointing to the guy with the big hair and the dark shirt. That'd be me. And one of those years at Mitchell Giurgola was spent here in Canberra. That was my time off for good behavior, having come off of some really substantial projects that as a 30-year-old I had no business running, but they let me run them anyway. And I got to spend time in Canberra in this absolutely wonderful country and got to know this country a little better, including a visit here 28 years ago to Melbourne with John and Jen. I had a very nice life as an architect, and there were many wonderful, sometimes award-winning projects that I got to do that changed people's lives, and I'll show you some because this way I get to show pictures of stuff as an architect to show you that I actually do have some credentials in that front. But a lot of university work and public sector work, Performing Arts Center. This is a little car and truck museum up near Philadelphia, up in the city of Allentown. An outdoor performing arts venue in Philadelphia, not the big shed, but all the little stuff that was added to it. Renovation of a lobby of a federal courthouse. and one of my favorites, a sort of very careful surgical renovation and restoration of an historic library up at Lehigh University. And I was a partner from 1986 to 2008, and I started to get the firm a little more involved in planning work. This big image being a 700-acre piece of park that we were asked to rethink, and it was the home of the American Centennial Exhibition in 1876 that kind of in some ways, put America on the map, on the world stage. So you can see what that says. I'm going to talk for a little bit. You can stop looking at the slides for a second. So in the year 2000, I was a board member of a 20-year-old organization called the Foundation for Architecture. It was a creation of the Philadelphia chapter of the American Institute of Architects. It ran programs of general interest to the public, such as tours and design education in schools, things like that. In fact, my wife, Greta, has been very involved in both of those things for a long time, including with the foundation. And one of the programs was called Civic Issues. It was a committee. I was the co-chair of the committee with a fellow named Bill Becker. Civic Issues was one of those programs that got people together to talk about things that were going on in town, a little bit of griping, a little bit of whining, a little bit of, gee, why aren't we doing this or that? And in 2000, the foundation shut down from financial problems. And I was able to relocate all the programs to other entities in town that had some kind of similar mission. But I couldn't relocate Civic Issues because Civic Issues, to be honest, was kind of the black sheep of the family due to its, what I would characterize as its regular flirtation with public criticism of projects that were occasionally developed or designed by or in some way promoted by various foundation board members. So it was a little bit of an issue that we always kind of, danced up to but never really danced with. So this fellow Bill and I, we were lamenting the loss of the foundation and the Civic Issues Committee one afternoon over lunch, and we decided to invite a few friends to meet and see if there was any interest in restarting this thing. And we had, and we were all somewhat troubled by the political climate in Philadelphia, in which design issues took a regular back seat. In fact, I would sort of say had no seat at all compared to the issue, the kind of demands of economics, of politics, of development. So we had this brilliant idea. We called it the Design Advocacy Group, or DAG, which I think has some weird Australian meaning. In fact, Tom and his team were kind enough to lend me an office. And in the office, I'm not making this up, in the office there's a 3-volume set of slang. Each volume is this thick. I couldn't believe it. And so I looked up DAG, and it had 2 meanings that were offered. Meaning 1 was excellent, first rate. That's good. Second meaning was some combination of matted wool and sheep excrement hanging from the tail of the sheep. And I thought, and you know what? There are people in Philadelphia who would say that our DAG is probably both of those. And there was a third meaning about nerdy or sort of awkward adolescence, probably also true. So this started with 2 of us, became 6, then it became 15, and within a few months it became 20 people, diehards, meeting every month in my office to lament the state of design thinking in the city. And rather unusual, this is a city that was actually designed in 1682 and had a great reputation as a place for planning and architecture. So I hope you don't keep laughing at this. DAG latched on to a proposed major parking garage project on a significant downtown street on land that was owned by a very important teaching hospital. The project needed 7 different variances from the code as it existed then, and so we sprung into action. We offered a public critique of the plan, including the architect who had designed it, colleagues and friends of ours. We made alternative plans. We got a lot of media attention because one of our core members really knew how to deal with the media. He actually was a journalist. And we generally annoyed all the powers behind the project. But in the process, we attracted a lot of pent-up energy around our advocacy. People were starting to notice. And so like any good windmill tilting kind of project, we lost. We lost the battle. The garage got built exactly where it was intended to be, although they poured enough money into it, partly thanks to our whining about it, that I would characterize it as a tolerably good addition to the city fabric, though not ultimately the right thing to put in that place. But meanwhile, the ranks of this organization grew to 30. We were given space at a downtown campus of Temple University, which is in some ways is somewhat comparable to University of Melbourne. It's the biggest university we have. I noticed there's some characteristics of the university here that were comparable to Temple's. And we attracted the attention of a local foundation, which had been quietly making investments in design and in advocacy projects for years, including one that I did as a practicing architect. The one that I showed you earlier was a plan for the 700 acres of our main public park, which coincidentally was in the council district of a young progressive councilman named Michael Nutter. So the clock moves forward to 2007. There's a wide open mayor's race in the city of Philadelphia. The design advocacy group is now meeting monthly with 60 or more people and a so-called membership base of 1,000 people. And I say it's so-called because we made a decision, Bill and I made a decision early on, that we were not going to become a real organization with real space, real staff, and that meant real need to be raising money all the time. We didn't want to do that. So everything, content and communications was done by volunteers, and frankly, it was enabled by the web. No web, no design advocacy group. This was done with almost no money. In fact, Bill and I consistently turned down offers from this particular foundation who wanted to keep funding us, and we kept saying no. So the 1,000 so-called members were simply people who had given us their email address. We communicated with them regularly through a listserv that we had on our computers at work. And the website design was the only thing we took money to build. So we took, I think, $20,000 from this foundation, and that was it. We got involved in the mayor's race by sponsoring a candidates forum on design. And by this time, the young councilman, Michael Nutter, he's a declared candidate for mayor, and he's running 5th in a field of 5 with no chance of winning. During our candidates forum, in which he and at least 2 of the other candidates showed up, it became clear to a crowd that was bigger than this, probably 600-700 people who came to this thing, that just shows you the depth of interest, came to the conclusion that Councilman Nutter was the only one, it was pretty clear, who actually appreciated design and was committed to desperately needed reform in planning, zoning, and development regulation. So there he is. Amazingly, all this pent-up energy, not just about design, but about a lot of things in Philadelphia, and he zooms from 5th place to 1st place in a matter of 2 months. And I'm not going to tell you it's because of what we did, but I will say that his commitment to design was part of a broader reform platform. It touched a lot of people's nerves, and much to our amazement, much to everybody's amazement, from being a cranky advocacy group that thought it would never have a chance at the seat at the table, this guy becomes mayor in January of 2008. And as a result of his election and his familiarity with me, partly because of this 700-acre planning project and partly because of the design advocacy group, he invited me to become a citizen member of the Philadelphia City Planning Commission. And this is the group with oversight for the operations of the 50-member commission staff. It was the same commission that was led by this guy, Ed Bacon, between 1949 and 1970, during which time Philadelphia underwent a massive transformation. In fact, I would say to you, it was the last great transformation of the city until right now. We're going to talk more about that later. My first job, well, this is an unpaid position, this being on the commission. So my first job as a member of the commission was to find an executive director for the commission, and that was a task that lasted 6 months and ended with me suggesting myself. We had some great candidates who were really flattered to be thought of as the head of the Philadelphia Planning Commission and be in this part of this legacy of Ed Bacon. And it didn't work out for a variety of reasons. I didn't force anybody to do this. They all had personal things. My mother just moved with me to some other city and just wasn't working. So I didn't expect to be suggesting myself, although, you know, maybe unconsciously I did. But there were a lot of people who were interested, they were flattered, they had a variety of personal reasons. And in June 2008, the mayor delivered a speech on planning to the Planning Commission. It was supposed to be a nice, simple little thing. It was intended as a modest event. It ballooned into a 700-person public presentation. These 700 people came together on 6 days' notice for this thing. And it was an indication of the depth of passion that Philadelphians had for the fate of their city. It was probably the same 700 people who showed up at the DAG candidates forum, too. The mayor gave a great talk. I had a hand in writing the talk, but we still had no executive director. And so that's when it kind of dawned on me that the answer to this question was me. And so I volunteered myself to our then deputy mayor, Andy Altman, there he is in the middle bottom, who was himself a planner by training and had been recruited by the mayor on the recommendation of the mayor of Washington, D.C. And so by November of that year, I was leaving my actually beloved partnership and was joining the city administration as its chief planner. 6 months later, Andy there in the middle picture was leaving to take the job as the executive of the London Legacy Project at the Olympics. And I became the acting deputy mayor and then eventually deputy mayor, and that's why I use the term accidental. And I say this, though I'm reminded, and has been reminded by the former head of the foundation that funded an awful lot of advocacy in Philadelphia, that meeting she hosted years before, in which she says that I said that someone was going to have to step up from the design community and take a leadership role in government if we were going to get anywhere with our agenda. She constantly reminds me of this, and I swear I don't remember saying it, but I'll either trust that I did or trust that she's telling a great story. So in a way, perhaps the term accidental was actually not so accidental. In any case, I left my practice, joined the city because I saw that Philadelphia was going through one of these once every 60-year transformation cycles. Most cities go through this. It's generational. It's a 3-generation phenomenon. I'm sure you could, if you track back the history of Melbourne, you'll see the same thing. It starts with a reform generation. It then devolves to their lieutenants who are hired to kind of run the machinery. And then it gets a little complacent. Sometimes it gets a little corrupt. And then it's followed by a new cycle of reform. It happens again and again and again. And so our last reform generation started after World War II, Home Rule Charter, Ed Bacon, several reform mayors who remade parts of the city and introduced a new narrative to one of America's most historic city, arguably America's most historic city. And despite the recent recession that hit American cities very hard, probably harder than they hit Australian cities, I continue to believe that we're in a transformation cycle and that we're changing the culture and narrative of this great city. So I want to talk about narratives a bit, and I want to show you, in order to do that, I want to show you a very abridged history of Philadelphia, because I think some of the things that you might see in it, while not directly like Melbourne's story, I think there's a thread and a pattern which you might recognize. So, I mean, here's how it starts in North America. The Dutch, there were some settlements before that, but the Dutch show up in New York Harbor, New Amsterdam Harbor, and they cut the first financial deal of North America, the first big financial deal. They so-called buy Manhattan Island from the Native Americans for $24 worth of trinkets. That's what we all learned in school. So it's a financial deal. The Dutch, I'm sure the Dutch came to the New World with all the same prejudices as everybody else had from the Old World. But when the Dutch came, they hung out a sign that said, "We're open for business. You got money, we'll do business." In Philadelphia, it's a different story. It's a little later in the game. All the good harbors are taken. The King of England, King George the First or Third, I'm not sure. It's one of the low numbers. Which is it? Which is it, Tom? Third? King George the Third. He owes William Penn's father a lot of money. So instead of paying him cash, he pays him in land in the New World. And William Penn comes to the New World, sails up the Delaware River 100 miles up from the ocean, and founds this community that he calls Philadelphia. And he's a utopian. He's a very practical utopian, but he's a utopian. He doesn't cut the deal with the local tribe, the Lenni Lenape Indians. He tries to make peace with them, and that's what that painting depicts. It starts as a relatively peaceful coexistence for William Penn. He does own the place. He's the proprietor. It's not a colony. Well, it is a colony of the Crown, but it's not a colony in the same sense as others. He's the proprietor. He owns the operation. He owns it lock, stock, and barrel. But he does have this kind of utopian sensibility, and he lays out with his surveyor, a guy named Thomas Home, a city that is somewhat based on the grid plan of Nancy in France. You may recognize that plan. It shows up again in Adelaide 125 years later. Center Square, 5 other squares that sort of become community centers around for neighborhoods. It's, I think, based on the Quaker Meeting House, which you see there in the image, the idea that the congregants are facing a center square space. They're looking at each other. It's the nature of this religious community. And also, William Penn's reacting. He lived in London in 1666. He saw the Great Fire of London, and he swore that wasn't going to happen in his city, particularly involving a rational street grid that would allow firefighting equipment to get to the fire without a map and trying to figure out where things are. So the Penn's vision gets executed. It's a piece of land between 2 rivers. It becomes a commercial enterprise on day 2, and it fills in very quickly, fills in faster than William Penn had envisioned, because he envisioned everybody having, in fact, Tom, you told me this, about this professor's walk, and these professors who would have enough land to grow vegetables and food. Well, that was kind of William Penn's vision, too. Everybody'd have enough land to really, in a certain way, self-sustain. But that's not how it happened. By day 3, this is what happened. In the images, everything crowded in, smaller streets, tighter grid, big streets, little street, although in those days, big street was what your Little Collins, Little Burke looked like. And it became a commercial enterprise. But he does a couple of things of note. He creates something called the Charter of Privileges, which is the kind of introductory document to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the U.S. Bill of Rights. So but he did retain ownership rights. He did have something in there that said he could veto anything that by way of additional rights that were put forward. And somewhere in the early 1700s, this fellow shows up in Philadelphia. He's a Bostonian, shows up at age 16. He becomes Philadelphia's most famous son. He does proceed literally to invent everything. He discovers electricity. He invents spectacles. He founds great universities, post offices, insurance companies, everything. And here he is in one of the more famous paintings depicted discovering electricity with a host of angels around him. But this thing about invention is really important. It's something Philadelphians don't remember. But the United States was invented in Philadelphia. It didn't happen in Philadelphia by accident, although Philadelphia was kind of a central geography to the American colonies. It happened very consciously because of that Charter of Privileges, because of a state of mind in the city that allowed for this kind of invention. And it happened right in those little modest rooms in what's now called Independence Hall, but what was the Pennsylvania State House at the time. The Declaration was written there. The Constitution was written there. It was introduced to the public in the public square behind those buildings. And Philadelphia keeps being a city of invention, of extraordinary invention. First municipal water system in 1820 with these spectacular neoclassical pavilions that are part of that kind of became one of the wonders of the world of 1820, still there. That's a contemporary picture. City of firsts, tons of firsts. Secular university, that's University of Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, public zoo, U.S. Navy, hospitals, the works. And as a result of that, and as a result of its commercial upbringing, also becomes what's called the workshop of the world, probably the most prolific industrial city of the 19th and early 20th century, along with Detroit. except unlike Detroit, which was focused on transportation, Philadelphia made everything else. Everything you could think of, from lounge furniture to tuxedos to war material. Philadelphia was the manufacturer of all of the uniforms that were used by the Union soldiers in the Civil War. It goes on and on and on. And other things are invented. The first modern sort of integrated park system in a major city in the United States happens in 1857, and it's all about preservation of the waterways, because the waterways were the drinking water sources. They were getting polluted by early 19th century industry. The state and the city, actually the state, took them back, created the park system around it to preserve the water system. And in fact, all of the major parks in the city are all based around conservation of rivers and streams. 9,000 acres of park, every single bit of it is rivers and stream. Now also incorporating some public squares as part of the recreational thing. 1876, the Centennial Exhibition is hosted in Philadelphia, celebrating America at 100. All kinds of crazy stuff is invented and displayed there. The first monorail in North America, this giant steam engine that powered the electricity for the affair, giant international exhibitions, Belgian waffles, early telefax machines. It was kind of stuff. And the sepia picture is actually a building that's still there. It was the only building that was preserved from the exhibition. It's now the main children's museum in the city. But it was built to be the art museum in the city of Philadelphia. And in the late 19th century, starting in 1876, finishing in 1901, Philadelphia is completely full of itself. I mean, in a big, big way. Builds the biggest municipal building in the United States with this crazy tower on it that's about 175 meters tall. Doesn't look it, but it's a 40-story building. And right up on top is a 37-foot statue of the founder, William Penn, quiet, modest Quaker, and now he's up presiding over everything you can see. And 17 years later, through this tight, dense grid, very similar in scale and scope to Melbourne's, the City Beautiful movement takes hold, and a giant diagonal boulevard is cut through the city. It took 30 years to pull this off. This giant boulevard is cut through the grid to connect the City Hall at one end and the Art Museum at the other, which was built 10 years after that diagonal boulevard was created, and is actually, aside from the city of Washington, which has all these diagonal boulevards, is the only actual City Beautiful boulevard in the United States that was ever actually realized. Chicago had a lot planned, never realized. So you get up to the Abe Bacon era. Philadelphia downtown is still very industrial. Big rail yards running through it. Under Bacon, all that, you can see it there in the lower left picture, all that's taken away. The modern downtown commercial the core is created under Bacon. After that, from the 1960s to 1990, was a pretty rough time for American cities, particularly in the 70s. And in Philadelphia, industry, which had been leaving from the 20s, got abated by the war. And as soon as the war was over, industry started leaving again in a very serious way. Loss of jobs, sort of devastation, old infrastructure, pretty tough time. In fact, that building in the lower left is a building that we're working on right now to get renovated as part of an urban corridor that would connect Temple University to the downtown, and that building is kind of the linchpin of it. So the narrative of the city is fundamentally different. The old narrative is industrial city, 65% of the people in Philadelphia are working in industry, and now it's totally different. So what is it now? So it's like a lot of cities. Institutions of higher learning in academics and medicine. We have the highest proportion of people working in those fields of any city in the United States, higher than Boston, a little bit. City of professional services, law, medicine, design, communications, home to the Comcast corporations. Comcast showed up in Australia yet? They will. They're now the owners of NBC, National Broadcasting System, Universal Communications. So they're a gigantic entity. Tourism, convention center, historic city, all these things are part of a deep economic base in the city. And arts and culture and the creative economy, the Philadelphia Museum, the Philadelphia Orchestra, something that's pictured there in the lower right, the Barnes Foundation, probably the finest collection of French Impressionist art in any private collection in the world, now with a new home in the city. But also kind of the small scale things, like in the upper right, up and coming neighborhood, kind of rough and tumble, former industrial area, now housing with markets in it on weekends and big television screens so we can watch the sporting events. And still, even though most of the industry is left, still some industry. Boat building, oddly enough. Oil refinery, I'm going to talk about that later. Rail car manufacturing, a lot of food businesses. And so that's who we are. That's who we are today. 1.5 million people, growing for the first time in 60 years. Very diverse group of people in the city. The mayor's there in the center. And by the way, a little warning, if you ever want to put a slide like this together from Melbourne, you got to rely on the web to get all these pictures, which means that you start thinking about your friends in a different way, and you start telling people, as I did, you know, your web picture stinks, and you gotta fix that. And so this gets to the point that I want to make about. I didn't show you simply to sort of do a Philadelphia travelogue. There's an important point I want to make about this, and it's about the inherent DNA of cities. Our DNA in Philadelphia comes from the values of our Quaker founder. And you might say, well, you know, that was then, this is now, the mix of people is different. The city is certainly not dominated by people who are Quakers necessarily, although there are plenty left. But, and you would think that that would make all this origin stuff somewhat irrelevant, but I'm not going to agree with that. This is a mobile society. Ours is, yours is, and people make choices about where they want to be. And in Australia, those choices are not simply which city or which state you want to be in, but in fact, you have global pressure because of the geographic isolation of this country and the great urge that you have to see the world. Go walk about, you know, call it what you will. You tend to get out for longer periods of time than we do. But we all make choices about staying in a place. Australians, Americans, and we frequently do it for reasons that are family or other practical ties that bind us to a place. But I'm going to suggest to you that when we make choices to stay, we do so because we relate to the essential DNA of place and the values that represent that place. Philadelphia doesn't have to be all Quaker to perpetuate Quaker values. It has to be people like me, like my family, like my friends, who appreciate those values and wish to incorporate them into their own lives and their own culture and belief systems. And so our DNA, I've thought about this a lot, our DNA has some very specific implications for the character of place. And what I want to do is show you a few slides to show you how that's played out. So one of those values is the streets as the public realm. The streets are the living rooms of the city, especially in a tight little grid formation, and we live in those streets. And you can see it represented by those kind of images, which are not atypical. Community in Philadelphia has always been as important as privacy. And I don't say that to say that we're all such great buddies, because we also have a nice deep history of fighting with each other and being cranky about our neighbors the way, you know, that happens in most cities. But there is, if you picture, any of you ever been to Phoenix? Phoenix is a city that has big blocks of stucco-colored 6-7 foot high walls that enclose developments. And so they live this very private life. I mean, I'm not saying good or bad, I'm just saying that's what it is. And community is achieved through other means, via the car, via restaurants, you know, via whatever. In Philadelphia, community has always been critical. And we balance it with the need for privacy. So my daughter and son-in-law just bought a house. It's a row house. they've got obligations to their neighbors. Their little backyard is looked down on by some other piece of property. You have to negotiate with that. Their street frontage is shared with other row house street frontages, so the character of the street you're on is dependent not just on you, but on everybody else. Your car's out there. Goes on and on like that. And you can see how we live. Every time we get a chance to build new housing, even when we have land, we still build row houses. Or they're kind of cousins, twins, two houses connected, little gardens in between. But they're always this kind of model. It's almost the same plan repeated over and over, generation after generation, with little variations. Raise it, put a porch on it, put a little garden in front, sometimes tuck a garage in the back and through an alleyway, but it's always the same plan. We obviously, this isn't just developer stuff. We love living like this. This is painfully true. Mixed use. Any big city, certainly I was talking about this at lunch with some of you the other day, the return to mixed use. That's where we started. Because of industry, we separated a lot of stuff out, and what we're seeing now is a return to commercial, industrial, residential mixed uses. Penn called Philadelphia his green country town, and there's a very long and deep tradition of greening. There's something called the Pennsylvania Horticulture Society, the oldest kind of garden society in North America, runs a spectacular, largest flower show in North America every year in the world, but also just small bits and pieces, neighbors taking back vacant property, people planting in front of their row houses. It's a tremendous interest in greening, in gardening, the likes of which we actually don't generally see in other cities. And of course, as a result of that, sustainability has become a big initiative, as it has in many cities. Ours is very much fueled by our geographic presence in the middle of the East Coast, great transit connections up and down the East Coast, great internal transit system, aging, problem, underfunded, problem, but nevertheless, the bones are there, ready to be used. And then, of course, various sustainability measures, including decorating our recycling trash trucks to look like they're more fun. And the reclaiming, the regreening, the reanimating of a lot of major public space, from Independence Mall to this lovely what's called Sister City Park on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, that big boulevard with kids playing in a little pond, and the remaking of the Great Plaza in front of City Hall, right now under construction. It also has involved the rejuvenation of 37 miles of waterfront. Philadelphians do not think of themselves as a waterfront city, and yet we've got an enormous river waterfront, 2 rivers. That was the origins of the city. All industrial, mostly, not entirely, now changed, and we're reclaiming it through a variety of plans and initiatives that I'll talk about more a little bit. But it's always been a place of innovation. This whole idea of invention is also part of the DNA of the city, from things like the first computer in America, called the ENIAC, at the University of Pennsylvania, the first insurance company, things medical research like the Wistar Institute, which is a private cancer institution, all the way to today of very strong initiatives around entrepreneurship, I'm sure like is going on in Melbourne with venture capital, and we're spending a lot of time as a city thinking through how we can enhance that. But it's not just technology, it's all kinds of things. It's food, it's manufacture, it's restaurants, it's bring your own bottle restaurants, it's clothing, it's a certain level of urban agriculture. All of it's going on at the same time. And so we've had to respond. We've done more planning in the last 5 years than have probably occurred in the last 50 years. Part of that's because the mayor believes it. We've undertaken the first comprehensive plan for the city, arguably, since 1682. We're in the midst of planning 18 different districts of the city, all with the intent of updating land use regulations, identifying new and needed opportunities for improvement of quality of life and growth. And we're doing it in collaboration, in many times, with other partners, where we have, particularly on our waterfronts, we've undertaken plans in collaboration with independent non-governmental organizations, our Economic Development Corporation, which is also independent, to create real working plans for the redevelopment, in particular of our waterfronts, all happening, as you can see in these pictures. We also felt the need to rewrite our zoning code, which nobody had touched in a comprehensive way for 50 years. And so a 4-year effort approved by the voters of the city of Philadelphia, approved into the creation of a zoning code commission, 31-member commission, appointments from all council members, appointments from the mayor, appointments from community groups. I chaired that for the 4 years, and 4 years later, we have a new code signed into law by the mayor and now operational. We also thought there was a need for something else. We created something called the Citizens Planning Institute, which is in certain ways the educational arm of the Planning Commission. It's now in its 4th training cycle. It educates citizens throughout the city on planning principles and practices so that they can smartly represent and respond to issues of development in their neighborhoods. We've now had, I think, 120 people run through these classes. You can see one of them there on the bottom. Incredibly popular thing, funded by the very same foundation that funded a lot of other stuff, and now we've adopted that funding into the mainstream of the Planning Commission's efforts. And for that, we were awarded, all these efforts, we were awarded National Planning Award recently in April, and I'm going to show you a quick video so that I can take a rest and you can watch a movie, but it's short.
Main Street.
Let's create more affordable, sustainable housing. Everyone needs a place to call home.
We need more support for our important community centers.
By 2035, we will have transformed dozens of industrial sites to benefit the entire community.
Si tuviera acceso a comida más saludable, como vegetales y frutas frescas, mi familia podría comer mejor.
It takes me too long to get to work at the Navy Yard. Let's extend the Broad Street line.
When we get jobs, we want to walk or bike to work rather than drive.
It will be cool to have safe bike paths and roads because then we won't need to use cars.
Public transportation is the sustainable future for the city of Philadelphia by reducing congestion and also improving upon our environmental footprint.
Won't building neighborhoods around public transit stations connect all of our residents to things that help them to thrive?
My mother taught me never to let things go to waste. Imagine what we could do with all this vacant land in Philadelphia.
More open spaces would mean places to play for everyone.
If we had a few more parks and recreational areas along the waterfront, I think that Philadelphia could be one of the greatest cities to live in America. But I guess we already are.
We'd like to see more public art.
It's terrific for all the people, all the visitors who come to see it, and for the artists who make it.
More great public art.
culture, all of it is a terrific basis for moving forward, and that's what Philadelphia 2035 will do.
So, I saw Tom looking at his watch a moment ago, and I'm going to tell you that, because I got a bit to go here, if anybody has to make a train, free to do it. This has been a great moment for the Planning Commission, so I was happy to be able to share that video. We've also, something I want to tell you about here is this, about economic theory, because my job starts to be broader than simply physical planning. And I believe, and I think probably many of you believe, that cities are all about connections and the ability to move between important nodes on foot and feel the kind of richness of the city. This is a study that we did back when I was in private practice, and it was a study of the center of the city. This was William Penn's original area between the two rivers, and we did a property-by-property analysis, grading properties on their ability to contribute to a walkable, sort of enriched public environment. The red is good, the gray is not so good. And it helped us really coalesce where the problems were, because a little bit of gray here and there was not a problem, but as you can see, there were block after block in some cases, and those are the places we're really concentrating a lot of our attention on. We also did that same thing for Temple University when we did a master plan for them, and they were shocked to see how weak some of their edges were. This has also kind of evolved for me into a bit of an economic theory. We started plotting out where the employment nodes of the city were, the dark ones in the center being the center of the city, strongest employment node in the city. We also started looking at the connections between them, physically looking at the connections and saying, were they any good? Could you walk them? Would you send your mother down that path? That's what I call the your mama test. And then we also tried to understand this kind of Da Vinci Code diagram here, sort of the relationship of those parts not just to each other, but to also to the edges and to the waterfronts, trying to analyze, well, like, it looks all very abstract. Literally, how do you do it? How do you get from here to there, and is it any good? I want to step back for a minute and tell you things that have been in my head for a while, because I think it gives you insight into sort of how I think about cities. I grew up in Brooklyn, which was the largest and probably craziest borough in the city of New York. Here's a Google image of where I grew up. It's the arrow on the right, on the left. And when I was age 8, I was standing in the back of that house in a sort of unused backyard, because we all played on the street. And the arrow on the right is an apartment house around the corner, totally out of my consciousness, 5 stories high, and I'm standing there, and it's winter, and a snowball lands at my feet from out of nowhere. And I look up to the roof of this apartment house, and I see these, 2 gloating teenagers who look like they just missed taking out a little kid. And I kind of remember this story because it didn't at the time, but looking back on it, I think of it as it showed me about the random connections through time and space that cities are very much about. And it's what cities do well. And despite all the technological marvels that we have, we still do it better than pretty much any other means available. So you fast forward from there to architecture school, and my mentor there, Ken Warrener, who would later be my thesis advisor, this is in freshman year, gives us an assignment. He says, draw the space between those 2 buildings. One's the architecture school, the other was the management school. And you've never seen more confused 18-year-olds in your life. I mean, like, draw the space? What's that? I thought I drew boxes that are kind of buildings. So, few other bits and pieces. Some of these were scrawled on the wall of the School of Architecture for God knows why. Lao Tzu, the reality of the vessel is the void within. Liu Khan, certainly a big part of my education and probably half the reason I'm in Philadelphia. Streets are the living rooms of the city. And Aldo Giurgola, my mentor and partner at one point, buildings are the fragments of a larger context. And we take these together, and I believe that fundamentally cities are about great public places, more than they are about great architecture. I get a little nervous saying that around my architecture friends, but you could phrase it like this. Great architecture is made great by the way it supports and enhances the public realm. And the ability of the city to seamlessly knit those kind of great spaces together is the true marker of a great city. Here are some of our great places in Philadelphia. So I want you to think about the places you have here in Melbourne, as well as in other parts of the world, and sort of what's memorable. What gives you that feeling of excitement, of well-being, of creative possibility? And here's a bunch of my favorites. You recognize probably every single one of them, so I'm not going to talk about them. Sorry to bring that top one up in the city of Melbourne, but, let's face it, it is an iconic image. This is kind of the thinking, the theory of cities. And so, I got to thinking about Melbourne. I hadn't been here for a long time. I haven't had a chance to wander around quite enough. But I'll bet there are places along the Yarra, the Queen Victoria Market, the alternating pattern of big and little streets, which I've always loved, those wonderful arcades in between. They're not only great places in their own right, but they're also the ones that draw together the past and the present. They suggest possibility, and in short, they reflect in some way that essential DNA of Melbourne, which I'm not going to define, but I'm going to challenge you to define. These are the things that are stuck in my head from 28 years ago. There's interesting buildings, too, but the power of architecture is only as good as its power to animate and enrich life, the life that we share in the public realm of any great city. So here's something else I kind of noticed, I didn't notice 28 years ago. I wasn't aware of the depth of Melbourne as a university city, a place of learning and study, but more importantly, a place where ideas are created. And we're such a place, too. Our region has the highest number of colleges and universities in the country, over 100 of them. Slightly more than Boston, which hardly anybody knows. We have around 150,000 students in the city proper out of a population of 1.5 million. 1 out of every 5 doctors in the United States was trained at one of our medical schools. National Center for Biomedical Research, fast becoming a city of technology, clean energy, and I'm apparently told by some survey somewhere that we're the best beer drinking city in America. Which means home for a lot of craft beer. And all of that's made possible by the depth of university life in the city, both through the ideas that are generated by our faculty and the energy generated by students and graduates. And I expect that this is much the same kind of place and the same kind of position. And given that asset, a natural question that arises is, what's the role of the university in the life and character of the city? Our universities in Philadelphia, here are the big 3, have all undergone an institutional epiphany of sorts over the last 2 decades. And this is led very much by the visionary ideas of those 3 people, the former president of Penn, Judith Rodin, her chief operating officer, John Fry, who's now the president of Drexel University, I'll keep it in the family, and the head of their real estate division, a fellow named Omar Blake, who's now a private developer who specializes in institutional and public-private partnerships. And what they discovered is pretty simple. And it's this. The university and the city both do better when the seam between them is lively and relatively invisible. And so think about Penn for a minute. There's the glorious main walk of Penn called Locust Walk. It's a cathedral of trees. It's spectacular. It is literally a cathedral of London plane trees. But the payback, the price it paid for this spectacular internal campus were a bunch of really bad edges. Buildings that backed up into the main streets, had no life, had no richness, had no nothing, bad architecture. I mean, there's any host of problems. I've seen some of those buildings here, too. But what those folks did, and so what were the results, by the way? Isolation within their communities, hostility from neighbors who were always suspect of whatever they were doing, and students who were sufficiently inattentive to the city in which they lived so that they left in droves after graduation. And so, over the course of a couple of decades, Penn first, now Drexel and Temple, as well as several smaller institutions have reached out to the city, created new places where the public and the academy share common ground. They've blurred the line between themselves and their surrounding community, and they've offered more access to their skill than ever before. And so here's some of the examples of how that happened. So here at Penn, totally dead Walnut Street has now got hotels, student residences, commercial activity. Even some of the buildings in the lower right, my firm actually did that, took a building that kind of backed into the street and gave it a kind of street presence. It's not a, you can't get in there. That's what's impossible to do, but at least it has a sense of presenting itself to the street. Penn also decided that the West Philadelphia neighborhood, my old neighborhood of 16 years, needed help. They built and they run that elementary school, the Sadie Alexander School. It's rejuvenated the neighborhood. You can get a sense of the neighborhood from the housing there. It's had a tremendous effect. Drexel now wants to do the same thing. At the University's School of Design, an operation was created by the fellow there on the top left, Harris Steinberg, called Penn Praxis, bridges the theoretical world with the practical, and they participate with us on any number of planning and visioning projects, including some of our waterfront projects. Drexel now, under the leadership of John Fry, same thing going on. Transforming major streets, taking setbacks that never made any sense, that kind of deadened the life of the street and the life of the university, and filling them in, mostly with residences, with commercial activity on the bottom. Temple, same thing. That big project in the upper left was actually one being done by my former firm. 1,500 students, major street, normal commercial on the bottom. They're also building new student facilities and just making that street work. They have committed to making that thing work. But it also happens at a smaller scale. Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, relatively small, famous institution for creating a lot of great painters in America. We worked with them to close a small street. They turned it into a little plaza between their two buildings. They introduced that paintbrush, which is a Klaus Oldenburg piece, as well as a large piece done by one of their students. And even places like over at the University of the Arts, where I spent a lot of time working, designed a great building for this space that never got built, ended in a bad dispute with some neighbors. Even that, the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society has built a little pop-up beer garden for the summer that has become an instant success and a great way to use the space, which you can see there in the lower left. And inevitably, they found some cargo containers to run a few food pavilions out of. And I mentioned to Tom the other day, I said, oh, cargo containers, that's so 2012. But I think, because of my role, I also think of the universities in a slightly different way. I think of them as also the major employers in the town. They are. They're the major engines of growth in the town. I've taught for years, for decades, at both Drexel and Penn. I value that experience, both for me personally and for the students, hopefully whose lives I can pollute. But in my job as deputy mayor, I also see these institutions as a kind of export-import business where they manufacture ideas, they sell them to prospective buyers, students and staff, but the difference is the buyer has to come to the institution and buy it. So all those people moving in, what a great economic idea. I once did a quick calculation of what it meant to the city. For every student who comes to the city from somewhere else, from out of town or from out of the country, 4 years, the value of that student to the economy of the city is somewhere between $350,000 and $500,000. And if they stay after graduation, the value in human capital and creativity is magnified. In fact, in 2006, 27% of those students stayed in Philadelphia. In 2012, 48% of them staying. So it's a marker of the success of our institutions to integrate themselves with the city. I believe that those things go hand in hand, but also how the city's narrative is changing. And part of that narrative is about entrepreneurial activity. So in their book called Startup Nation, it's the story of the evolution of the entrepreneurial culture in Israel, the authors talk about a Harvard professor, Michael Porter's construct of an economic cluster. And in it, and I know I'm going to oversimplify this, I apologize to any Michael Porter fans in the room, is that the confluence of academics, businesses, support services, and capital, all in a tight geographic area, makes for a very powerful economic engine that fuels the competitiveness of cities, or in this case, the competitiveness in an entire country. So why is that important to cities? Look, nobody thinks that cities are going to become a place where the majority of people are all self-employed and they're creating businesses every 3 minutes. We're all probably going to mostly work for somebody. But if there's one lesson to be learned about the big changes in Western culture, it's this. Globalized economy demands that cities like Melbourne and Philadelphia and many other cities commit themselves to a culture of entrepreneurialism, or we're going to lose talent, and we're ultimately going to become more stagnant as people move around to more supportive cultures. This is especially true for cities in Australia and the United States, where the temptation to narrow the door for immigration is powerfully countered by the demand for new ideas and talent, particularly from an ambitious immigrant community who are attracted to our more open societies. And so for me, growth isn't a choice, it's an imperative. And cities are the natural places for growth to occur because they have both the social and physical foundations that make Professor Porter's clusters more inevitable. It also means that there'll be demands put on everything: aging infrastructure, social conventions, historic artifacts, and to be honest, for most people, change itself is very stressful. And I've heard our mayor say this many times. I'll repeat the joke. In Philadelphia, we demand change as long as everything remains fundamentally the same. So, as a public official with responsibilities for how the city feels and how well it performs economically, I regularly find myself between competing forces of growth and preservation, modern and historic, new blood, old blood, wealth, poverty. And there's really no way out for a public figure. This is the house we live in. In fact, there is no other house. And so, daily life becomes a balancing act of giving one set of values slightly more weight without diminishing the importance or validity of the other legitimate values. And I want to give you a very quick example. You may have an example like this in Melbourne. Philadelphia is home to the oldest oil refinery in the United States. Because oil was discovered in western Pennsylvania in the 1870s, it was refined in Philadelphia by a company named the Sun Oil Company, or more commonly known as Sunoco. Most of that oil is referred to as light sweet crude, which is the craziest description I've ever heard for oil. But most of it comes from Nigeria. 2 years ago, Sunoco said they're going to close this refinery, they're going to shut it down, we're going to lose 1,000 jobs, and a massive supply chain of pipe fitters, iron workers, electricians, and other suppliers. In addition to the loss of jobs, 3,000 acres, all very close to the center, close to the universities, close to the airport, was going to go fallow with no money in sight for remediation. And believe me, this site needed remediation. What happened? Carlyle Group, which is a private equity firm with a particular interest in investments in what you might call traditional industry, partnered with a new executive at Sunoco and created something called the Philadelphia Energy Solutions. And their goal wasn't to save this refinery, it was to grow the refinery by making major investments that will allow it to diversify its sources of crude oil. They've aggressively begun that process. They're building a new rail terminal. They are accepting a huge amount of oil from North Dakota in the United States. And in the process, they're fundamentally changing the nature of the refinery, as well as shifting from one that has a majority foreign crude to one that processes a majority of domestic crude. And in doing so, all the jobs were saved and the job base is expanded. So when the company was launched, I went to the opening. There are some of the new employees of Philadelphia Energy Solutions. And a friend of mine asked me about how I felt about the outcome. After all, he said, we need to lessen our reliance on oil, true, in favor of more sustainable energy. And wouldn't I regret not having 3,000 fresh acres of land to be fooling with? And my answer was immediate and unequivocal. Yep, we need to lessen our reliance on oil, no question about it. And we need to lessen our reliance on cars, oil consumption, and yes, it would really be great to have a pallet of 3,000 acres to replant. But when I looked at those guys, as I was sitting on the little platform, and I looked at those guys in the crowd, and I thought about the hundreds of workers that they represent, in fact, 1,000 workers that they represent who rely on this place for a living, it just became obvious to me that managing its growth was ultimately better for Philadelphians than all the arguments in favor of its demise. Which, you'll be happy to hear, Tom, brings me to the final point I want to make tonight. He's saying, yeah, that's great. And by the way, Philadelphia is also the home to something called the EEB, terrible name, Energy Efficient Buildings Hub. It's a national research center for lessening the use of energy in our buildings, which is a great thing for the city of Philadelphia. So, the final point. Thousands and thousands of people every day are making decisions about how life should go for themselves and for others. And all these others, all of us, are reacting to those decisions by buying or not buying, supporting or protesting, engaging or ignoring. And the cumulative whole of all those propositions and reactions is what makes our system of self-government so vital and admittedly so frustrating. In my country, we've spent decades being convinced by many in leadership that government is best, that interferes with this system the least. And I can see pretty clearly why and how too much government causes confusion and can, in fact, stymie growth. But I also see quite clearly the places where government is the ultimate and appropriate regulator of the balance between private initiative and public good, whether it's at the national level or whether it's at the local level. So I said earlier that cities are the natural engines of growth and that great cities are places that are characterized by a network of great public space. We in the design community have a special perspective on this because we are all trained to understand the physical world on its own terms, not in rhetorical terms. But we fail when we insist that the design result is the one that should always decide an issue, because cities, in the end, are pretty complex inventions of the human spirit, and we just can't control all the action as much as we might like to try. So we have to plan, we do have to plan, and then we have to let our plans subject themselves to the wisdom of individual decisions. At one moment we're the proposers, and another moment we're the reactors, always weighing the relative merits on behalf of the common good. And I have to tell you, this can be a very unsatisfying endeavor, especially compared to the pleasure of seeing something you designed as an architect, as I have, get built and get productively used. But if we want our cities to thrive, and we do need to want our cities to thrive, then we have to approach our work with vision and then with fluidity. I've learned from both teaching and from practice that good ideas can come from unlikely sources, and that the key to leadership is to know when to pull from the front and when to push from behind. And along the way, mistakes get made, something that the public and the government don't reckon with very well. But like in the startup community, you try to minimize your mistakes, and when they're made, you try to learn from them and move forward. The reward in Philadelphia, and I strongly suspect in Melbourne too, is that one day people look at your city and realize that an extraordinary transformation did in fact take place. But now, a new set of issues await the next generation to engage with the same conviction and courage. And so, as all of you might say to them, good on you. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thank you very much for that. You helped us link a few points, I think. We started off, in the middle of it, you told us that cities are about great public places, and that's indeed where the visceral experience of cities. You also said cities are about connections, and they're about cultural connections, they're about political connections, they're about physical connections, but also about social and spiritual connections. And I think that story leads us all the way through to your final point, which is about conviction. Cities are long-term articulations of conviction. And it's about carrying those convictions from generation to generation, what you call the DNA, which allows us to realize these cities. There's voice of the people, but there's the leadership required as well. This is a very pertinent story for us here in Melbourne. We have a series of experiments, I think. We've had a series of events over decades where we've tried to articulate such visions and such commitments. And some of them get realized. The experience you've had of coming back after 28 years to a city and seen the vitality which is here today is a story of conviction over a long period of time. But we also have other convictions which we allow to get waylaid. So we've got, for example, the Melbourne 2030 plan, which has been eroded. But as you walk your way back through Melbourne's history, we have a series of such plans which we've allowed the convictions to be eroded. We've actually got an experience right now, I think, the Ministerial Advisory Committee on Planning, where conviction has been articulated by the people who've contributed. We can only hope that the Minister listens and carries this through, because indeed we want a city of conviction. So thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Tom.